In his collection of essays, Philosophy as Cultural Politics, Rorty wants to argue that our worldviews, our conceptual frameworks, our core belief systems should be viewed as alternative language games, and which one should be used is also a matter of cultural politics. Which ones are reasonable to believe? Which ones are rationally justified? These are all matters settled by a particular society's cultural politics. So we've known cultural politics as limited to the realm of political correctness. What terms we should use to designate which person, such as mixed race, illegitimacy, what beliefs should be rationally acceptable. They exclude race as a determinant of behavior as opposed to genetics, but they're also relevant as to whether which language games are rationally justified. So in the modern Western world, a monotheistic worldview has replaced the ancient Greeks and other cultures' polytheism because, as a matter of cultural politics, our society has found monotheism more beneficial to our society. He also argues that pragmatism as a language game should be preferred to theisms that go beyond a religion based on social gospel. So the value of religious belief for Rorty is based on social benefits. Okay, so a religion or a theology that is based primarily on social gospel, that would be an example of liberation theology. And pragmatism should be preferred in which personal experience is combined with a belief in a single God's authority, monotheism, and a view about authority. And the language game of pragmatism should be preferred to religious views that makes claims about natural theology. Examples, proofs that there must be a single creator, an uncaused cause, an absolute understood as a wholly other. So, in the language games we accept in our society, we do accept personal experience as a justified basis for God's existence, but not all forms of personal experience. So, for example, we may reject those whose personal experience is of a female deity and accept other experiences that are visions of those who have a vision of the risen Christ. And my example would be we reject cults based on certain unacceptable beliefs that, for example, becoming a suicide bomber will assure an afterlife with 40 virgins at your side. Now, one obvious criticism of using social benefit as a basis for which theories should be tolerated is that certain topics could be banned in this if they stand in the way of the long-term development of human beings or in terms of sustaining our natural environment. His example, people who criticize the development of the atomic bomb as these scientists should have never studied radioactivity, given the current state of the threat of a nuclear warfare. My example, the recent example of not identifying the source of the coronavirus in 2 elderly residents in a nursing home in Santa Clara because it could stimulate anti-Chinese sentiment. Another good example is not discussing the horrific details of German concentration camps because it could lead to cynicism and hopelessness about us as progressive beings. Rorty agrees with William James that truth and reality exist for the sake of social practices and not vice versa, that we choose social practices on the basis of how they enable us to apprehend truth and reality. He agrees with Robert Brandom, who is actually his student, that we can distinguish two different types of authority for two different types of language games. So, for example, in science, the relevant authority is the appeal to the consensus of experts who have used the scientific method, and other spheres, it's a matter of cultural norms. This actually is similar to Jürgen Habermas's ideas in his book Knowledge and Human Interests, where he distinguishes three different spheres of human interests: science and mathematics, art and literature, and politics, ethics, and law, as having different criteria for their rational justification. So he would agree science, in the realm of science, we use the scientific method, the consensus of scientific experts. I would add logical criteria for a valid scientific theory. In the realm of art and literature, it's authenticity of personal expression that's the basis for good art. And all other matters, for example, politics, law, morality, it's a matter of consensus among language users who participate in communicative action. So, for example, if we had a problem such as food scarcity and we had to make a social policy based on whose needs are the most important, we would want a dialogue among all those who have an interest, who are affected by food policy, and we certainly would want to include those who are starving or who have experienced famine. So, in Habermas's view, when we gather around this hypothetical roundtable to discuss an issue such as food policy, we are moved by the voice of those who have the most important need interpretations. So, there is in our society currently disagreement about the implications of God's authority, depending on monotheistic or polytheistic views, or dependent on the authority in our interpretations of the Bible versus the Quran. But does the conclusion necessarily follow that God's authority can't be appealed to if there's disagreement about human interpretations of God's authority? So, I would compare that to disagreement in science about the validity of scientific theories, where there's disagreement about one theory versus another. So, for example, which is the more logically supportable theory, string theory or quantum theory? And because these experts disagree, we haven't rejected scientific method or scientific experts as authoritative. So currently, our linguistic conventions regarding which personal experiences or which forms of awareness should count as a justified basis for existence claims aren't currently a matter of consensus, because one group holds to a verificationist theory of belief, which is limited to beliefs that can be verified or falsified through testing. So there's disagreement in our culture about whether verificationism is essential to a viewpoint's validity. American philosopher Tom Nagel argues that this approach has, and here I quote from Philosophy as Cultural Politics, an insufficiently robust sense of reality and of its independence of any particular form of human understanding. So he would ask, what would be lost if our linguistic conventions were limited to only verifiable experiences? I would say that there are certain states that we regard as valuable and having rational justification certain insights or experiences that we obtain in meditative states, in forms of prayer, in the experience of mystery and ineffability. So to reject poetry as a means of getting the truth about our experience of mystery would be insufficient. For that reason, my criticism of American pragmatism is that for Rorty, the issue of the pragmatic value of beliefs in God's existence is based on whether these beliefs make us better people, more hopeful, and less prone to despair. But this approach fails to look at or answer the question whether these beliefs would have these positive effects if they weren't true. Compare this with a scientific theory like quantum physics. Scientists accept Einstein's theory of relativity and subsequent theories of quantum physics that have been validated by the scientific method and by the consensus of scientific experts due to these theories' success with regard to predictions about various states of matter, both at the micro and the macro level. But their science-based truth may be replaced by a future theory that better explains the same phenomena and possible anomalies. This future theory, currently unknown, possibly because we haven't developed the technology to adequately test it, would suggest we currently don't know why our own current theory works, given these future additional beliefs will be also rationally justified and are part of the explanation for why it works. Our own cultural politics, according to Rorty, allows for rationally justified theological and metaphysical arguments about God, about objects as distinct from their qualities, about the reality of the external world. But given that these arguments entail assumptions that go beyond our personal human experiences, Rorty argues they aren't as conclusive as scientific ones. One question Rorty might have considered was, is this view that scientific viewpoints are more conclusive, but just as rationally justified as metaphysical theories, is this view consistent with Rorty's view that they're all metaphors? His conclusion is that there's no neutral criterion by which we can judge one metaphysical language game as superior to another because they may be incommensurable. He's made this argument regarding whether our experience of beauty is sufficient to console us in our tragic lives of suffering, and he rejects that view, that beauty and our experiences of beauty can console us in terms of our lives of which have tragic dimensions. One way to explain this problem of incommensurability is to use the issue of quantifiability, in which case we know there wouldn't be a way to answer the following question: how many profound experiences of beauty does a survivor of torture require to be consoled? Compare this problem of incommensurability with the ethical issues involved in deciding what kind of compensation an insurance company should pay to the family of someone whose death was a result of negligence. We all are worried that there's no way to measure the value of human life. And certainly when insurance companies and corporations have determined that value to be a function of a person's productivity, given this would leave out a lot of valuable work done in the domestic realm. But We also agree that we can't fail to try to compensate those whose accidents have been a result of negligence. So, in describing American pragmatism as romantic polytheism, he's offering a stipulative definition of polytheism, and it's that it's a worldview consisting of many ideals, which could include ideas of the sublime as wholly other, of transcendence, and other abstract ideals. He also claims that poetry plays an essential role in our understanding of some of the mysteries of human existence, including, as I mentioned earlier, our forms of transcendent consciousness in prayer, meditation, and in the experience of ineffable beauty. One reason for defending poetry and art and religion from a pragmatic point of view as valuable is in terms of their providing support for our authentic individuality. For this reason, cultural politics should provide a logical space for the operation of these language games, given the value of being autonomous and authentic persons who desire to maximize a number of their capabilities. But our culture should also provide space for not only ideals of personal self-realization and perfection, but also for ideals and practices of solidarity as essential to achieving social justice. So pragmatism replaces the ideal of truth as unitary, one single absolute foundation for all truths, which operates as a neutral criterion by which to settle matters over there which is disagreement, replacing that as a foundation for true belief with one of intersubjective agreement, similar to the one I just described, provided by Jürgen Habermas. So, in replacing the ideal of truth as unitary, we would be better off with one that's concerned with intersubjective agreement, concerned with gaining mastery over questionable data, and one which has a goal of synthesizing little theories into a bigger one instead of articulating a single preordained big theory. Rorty sees this desire for this one single big theory of the absolute foundation as similar to that of allegiance to one big, powerful, non-human being. They're both issues that stem from our desire for certainty. Rorty also claims in A Philosophy as Cultural Politics that despite his arguments to the contrary, William James believes that, here's a quote, "There is something wrong with us as we naturally stand, and that we are saved from this wrongness by making proper connections with the higher powers." James also describes this as an individual being connected to, quote, "a wider self from which saving experiences come." I would wonder, is this expansive self who has the desire for a desire for perfection, but limited capabilities for achieving it, possibly the exemplar being Jesus's life, or is this an experience of an expansive self who has obtained solidarity with all persons? In contrast, John Dewey, also a secular pragmatist, supports Christianity as a worldview that promotes solidarity, but Dewey didn't think its contemporary forms achieved this. Dewey supports both religious feeling and poetry as unforced flowers of life. and our personal experiences of divinity and other sublimities as providing the basis for creating through our own eyes the language games of both poetry and religious feeling.